Good evening. My name is Steve Hernandez, and I'm the Executive Director of the Legislature's Nonpartisan Commission on Women, Children, Seniors, Equity, and Opportunity. We are here today to conduct the first of a series of conversations that we will be hosting in the state of Connecticut on the right to read, a literacy initiative for equity. I'm really excited today to be joined by this particular panel of leaders in the state of Connecticut. It feels a lot like a homecoming, and I'll tell you, many years ago in the state of Connecticut, there was visionary leadership around ed reform that really focused on what we knew worked. And what we knew is that early literacy, particularly literacy by third grade, but also throughout the life cycle, was one of those benchmarks of opportunity that determined whether or not we were able to succeed beyond third grade, learning to read and reading to learn, but also throughout life. So I'm especially honored today to be joined by our panelists. I'm going to mention each of your names, but I'm going to want each of you to introduce yourselves because as you introduce yourself, as you know, your face becomes prominent in this little Brady Bunch of Zoom. We are today on Facebook Live, and we will also be rebroadcasting on CTN. We will make this recording available to CTN. So for our Facebook Live viewers, I encourage you to participate. Give your feedback in the chat function. We will be receiving that feedback as we have tonight's conversation, and we're very excited to start our conversation now. Firstly, with us, we have Shavar Jeffries, who is the National President of Education Reform Now. We are also joined by the House Majority Leader for the Connecticut General Assembly, the Honorable Jason Rojas, the Honorable Patricia Miller, Assistant Majority Leader, and the Honorable Brandon McGee Jr., State Representative who represents the heart of our state. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome you first, Shavar Jeffries. Shavar, you are new to this holiday table of literacy, but you're not new to the issue. So please introduce yourself and let us know why this is important to you.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be with such great leaders in the state of Connecticut. First, I'm a civil rights attorney, and as you said, I'm the president of Education Reform Now. We're a national advocacy organization that fights to make sure that every student in this country has access to quality public education, including in the state of Connecticut. And why this matters so much to me personally is education changed my life. I'm not from Connecticut. I'm from the great state of New Jersey. I grew up in the South Ward of Newark, New Jersey. When I grew up, college was something like Mars. That was something we kind of heard about, but we didn't know anybody who went there. And because of the opportunity to get a great education, I'd be the first in my family to go to college, let alone become a lawyer. And it kind of just transformed not only my life, but the life of my children and my broader family. And inextricably connected to that was the ability to read and write at a very high level. And so this conversation is actually fundamental to my kind of personal values, as well as to the work we do at the organization that I lead, and that our director in Connecticut, Amy Dow, I know work with so many of you each and every day to advance. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Majority Leader Rojas, if I may, you were not only an early adopter, but an early leader in this work. I remember working with you on the Achievement Gap Task Force, which is what we called it at the time. We now know that mostly this is about an opportunity gap for so many of our young people. But welcome, Majority Leader.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I want to, my other panelists, I want to welcome them and thank them for being here today. My name is Jason Rojas. I represent the great communities of East Hartford and Manchester, just beginning my 7th term. You know, in reading, I think similar to Shavar's comments, right? Reading is just a foundational skill that is so critical to academic success throughout all of your education and academic career. And obviously, as you become an adult, right? And I think people miss that. Literacy is so critical to advancing yourself socially and advancing yourself economically. And for whatever reason, I was blessed to have had a really strong interest in reading at a very young age. So, you know, I was that 9 or 10-year-old that for some reason was interested in newspapers. And, you know, when I got into college, I was reading 5 or 6 newspapers a day. I'm not quite sure why. Obviously, it was a good thing to do no matter what, but I was reading the same news articles from paper to paper. But, you know, people who know me know I surround myself with books. I now surround my children with books, you know, because it's so foundational. We were joking a little bit earlier before we started, you know, Representative Billy Miller is a math major, but reading is critical to being a mathematician, right? It's critical to being a scientist. It's critical to being a doctor. No matter what career interest you might have, reading is so foundational to whatever it is you want to do. I mean, clearly here in Connecticut, we have not met the expectations I think we have for the children of our state. And we need to do all we can to improve the ability of our educators in the classroom to provide our children the highest quality experience that they can give them and give those teachers the skill set I think they want to ensure that they're preparing their students for success for after they have them in whatever grade they have them. So doing anything we can do to improve how we teach reading here in Connecticut has certainly a lot of economic benefits too. Right, I know we talk about personal enrichment and personal educational advancement, but it's also essential to our state's economy in ensuring that we have the best workforce in the world to fill a lot of the jobs that we know exist out there. And Connecticut very much has a knowledge-based economy. And even though we're traditionally been a manufacturing-based economy, even that has become knowledge-based and highly technical. And we need to ensure that that pipeline of young people have the opportunity to take advantage of the careers that are out there for them.
Thank you, Representative. I'm going to come back to you on that vision because it's comprehensive, it's thorough, and it really does highlight the importance of literacy in so much of what we do, so much of our strategy for success for the state and for our families. So I'll be back to you on that. When I think about the body of leadership that has expressed itself around the work of early literacy, I think of the heart and soul of this work, Representative Miller. From very early on, you have been not only a supporter of the literacy initiative, but in a lot of ways our guide as we develop this work over the years. So welcome, Representative Miller.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Stephen, and welcome to my panelists. I can't add any more to what Jason and Shavar has said. I think as individuals of color, we know the struggles that we face and that our students face. And I fight this battle from a personal perspective, that I know that what I was up against when I was in school and I had a problem with comprehension and no one could identify it. I could read, but could I understand what I read? And so I struggled. I was bright. I did good grades, but it went in one ear and out the other, one side of my brain and out the other. And so I know the importance of literacy. And I know the importance of education. For me, this is about the students having access to opportunity. That's why we changed it from an achievement gap to opportunity gap, because it's about opportunity. Shavar had an opportunity, Jason had an opportunity, and Brandon had an opportunity. We've had opportunities to succeed, and that's what we need to do for our students in Connecticut. We need to make sure that we give them the opportunity to succeed. Jason talked about, Miss Majority Leader talked about, the economic impacts. I mean, it's broad-based. It's not just personal, it's economics. I just read recently that high school dropouts aren't eligible for 90% of our jobs. That's 90% that they're not eligible for. So what does that do to our economy? But for me, it's more on a personal level. I can't even imagine being in school all day for 12 grades, 12 years, and not know how to read. And I saw it. I saw it when I was a substitute teacher, where I had a young man who was just passed through, and he would sit there and just stare all day, all day in class. And so I don't want to see that. I want students to succeed. And that's what it's about. I want them to have the same opportunity that the three of us or the four of us have had on this panel to succeed. To say, because it's about your self-value and your self-esteem as well. So we talk about schools being a pipeline to prison. Yeah, because guess what? If I can't get a job, I'm going to find some way. I'm going to find some way to earn a living. And usually if I can't read or don't have an education, it's usually some illegal means. So I want to stop that as well. Instead of our money's going into prisons, I want us to invest into colleges and vocational schools and training programs. So that's why I do this work.
Thank you, Representative Miller. Literacy as a pipeline to success is such a resounding purpose in the work that each of you leads. Representative McGee, as the immediate past chair of the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus as a dad, and as a leader in so many different ways in the state. Literacy, as you know, is connected to so many of the other efforts that we are managing and ushering through the policy process, but also as we look into the future of the state. Tell us a little bit about why this is important to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephen, and to the commission and to the majority leader and our good friend, Shavar, and obviously the none other than Honorable Rep. Billy Miller. Thank you for this opportunity to participate in such, I would say, a weighty, very important conversation. While we're talking about literacy, you know, everything that you all have said, I support and underscore, and I won't repeat. But what I will say, there are a few benefits of literacy in the fight against poverty, right? And for me, my folks have always told me, in order to get out of poverty and make something of yourself, you have to go to school. You know, Shavar talked about it. College was sort of like, okay, yeah, you talking about it, but how you gonna get there? And for me, in my adult life, and using this platform to provide opportunities through policymaking for those young people and families, it's important that we do a few things, and this is one of them: to fight for literacy, the importance of it, but also against poverty. And we know that literacy, it improves health. Literacy promotes lifelong learning, and it builds skills. Here's one: literacy promotes gender equality, promotes democracy and peace. I could probably rattle on the importance of literacy, but I'm so very thankful that we have this opportunity to unpack some of the very disappointing numbers. I read some numbers today. It weighs me down to know that our children are not reading at grade level. I'm saying like only 3% are reading at grade level in some areas. That to me, anyway, we'll be able to kind of jump in throughout this conversation. But once again, thank you so much for this chance to weigh in on such an important topic.
Thank you, Brandon. You know, I really appreciate Representative McGee, you highlighting the history here, because for so long, this is called a right to read initiative and a right to read purpose. And for so long, that right to read was denied to people who look like us on this panel. There's a history there. So, Attorney Jeffries, I'd love for you to focus a little bit. You know, it's always important to tell the story and the history behind the work that we do, because it contextualizes our purpose. So, Attorney Jeffries, I'd love to hear a little bit of that history as you know it, just to frame our conversation.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about the history of race in this country, you know, of course, anti-Blackness is really at the heart of it. After the Nat Turner Revolt in 1830, essentially the entirety of what became the Confederacy, so basically all of the South outside of the border states, Maryland, Kentucky, the entire South passed, as part of what they called the slave codes. They made it a crime, not just a civil violation, a crime to teach Black people how to read. And that's very powerful, because it tells you something, that if you actually want to keep some folk in bondage, the ability to read operates at cross purposes with that. Because what happened was, as Nat Turner and his colleagues, and he was one of many resistors who ran away or who took arms to bring violence to slave owners, but they realized that the more knowledgeable people had, the less they were willing to endure the inhumanity of slavery, right? And so it was a crime in large parts of this country to teach Black people how to read, and that extended to others, right? So we would even see post-slavery in the Jim Crow era, not only in terms of educational inequities visited upon the freed people, but we would see rules that ban immigrants from having access to educational opportunities. We saw that applied to Hispanic immigrants, Chinese immigrants. We had a Chinese Exclusion Act, and their educational outgrowths of that, in which education was, we've seen broad-based restrictions on girls and women being educated at effective levels. So it's very important to understand that a lot of what we're dealing with today is part and parcel of a history. So even after it became legal and lawful, then we might see that many of the schools that serve particularly low income students of color and immigrant students don't have access to the resources to educate students effectively. We know that in many parts of our country, that school funding is based on property taxes. New Jersey and Connecticut, we've had some efforts obviously to ameliorate that, but that continues to be a challenge in making sure that we have the resources that our young people need to learn. So it's very important to situate what's happening today in this broader history, because once you understand the history, you understand that what we're dealing with today isn't accidental. It's not incidental. It's part and parcel of that history. And it's going to take, just like it took a systematic effort to reduce folk of color. And by the way, I should say this too, low-income white folks also didn't have access to quality schools as well. Now, they weren't as disinvested as the ones that were available to people of color, but they too didn't have much. But of course, what the conceit was, well, at least you ain't these Negroes, so you should feel better about, so you're ignorant, you just ain't as ignorant as them, so feel better about that, right? And so we have to come together across these lines of difference, across these artificial lines. Clearly, there's an empirical history that we have to wrestle with, but we have to come across these lines, come together and recognize that until all of our children have access to the quality of education that they deserve, none of us will have the type of society that we ought to have.
Thank you, Attorney Jeffries. You know, I think about the corridor, this corridor of our cities in the state of Connecticut, Black and brown children. But I also think about, to your point, the far eastern and quiet parts of the state, where there are people who happen to be white but are poor, and they lack the same and similar types of opportunities, and their children are also being left behind because they don't have those opportunities. So I love the idea of working across difference in order to achieve similar and resonant purpose. I think that's a really strong statement. So thank you for that. Majority Leader, what's interesting is this notion of literacy and the economy. We often talk about bringing resources to the educational space, but we never finish the sentence. The fact that our children and their learning is the resource of the future of the state. So I'd love to hear your strategy or your thinking about breaking intergenerational cycles of poverty and breaking intergenerational cycles of lack of opportunity. What does that look like to you as Majority Leader?
Well, that is a tough question. I mean, it's obviously multifaceted, right? And we think back to the Achievement Gap Task Force and the work that we produced out of that. And there was a recognition at that time, we went in thinking about education and closing achievement gaps around education. But as we continued on with our work, we realized it was far more multifaceted than that, right? It incorporated housing, it incorporated food insecurity, it incorporated all those other conditions would impact the ability of a child, access to healthcare, right? It impacts the ability of a child to be even in a position to learn if they got a rumble in their tummy or if they got a toothache that can't get taken care of, right? So there really is a need to look at this holistically. But something that's been incredibly salient over the last year is this conversation around segregation, right? Which is not new, with economic and racial isolation and concentration of poverty. And in Connecticut, and blue Connecticut and progressive Connecticut, I say both of those with a bit of sarcasm there. We are not as blue and or progressive as we like to make ourselves out to be. We have some of the worst disparities in the country right here in Connecticut, in a place that has enormous resources and enormous social capital. And how do we open up access to those resources so that everyone can benefit from it? Connecticut is hyperlocal. Our school district borders have to be coterminous with town lines. We're overly dependent on the property tax. Our towns and cities don't have diversified revenue streams to be able to raise the resources that they need to adequately fund education. The state does provide funding in the form of the education cost sharing grant that goes down to towns. But we haven't been able to invest the resources that's needed to really fully fund that program. We're probably short $700-800 million in funding the education cost sharing grant. And obviously that's to the detriment primarily of our communities of color and our lower income communities and communities where there are poor white folks too, like in Eastern Connecticut and in Naugatuck Valley and increasingly in a lot of our inner ring suburbs. As you know, as poverty is leapfrogged from just concentrating on our urban centers, we now see it in our suburban communities. And the challenge in that is that a lot of our suburban communities don't have the nonprofit infrastructure that helps to fill that gap, where the government is falling short in terms of providing the resources that we need to meet children's needs. And that's a difficult conversation to have. You know, we know it's being had right now. There's a lot of fear about what that means, right? To integrate a community or to build affordable housing in communities outside of our urban core. And we need to find ways to get around that, right? Those are fears that are not unique to Connecticut. That is an American phenomenon. And you know, it just happens to be that, you know, Connecticut, because of our governance structures, exacerbate the problems that we face. You know, when we operate in 18 square mile geographic areas, it makes it a whole lot more difficult for local governments to adequately address these issues that are far regional in nature. And that's why you see states around the country actually do a lot better job of addressing these issues, because they operate at a level where they can share resources, or where resources are spread out among more people. You know, I always look at Montgomery County, Maryland, right? Their school district has like 200,000 students, right? The largest school district in Connecticut is 20. And so we have to think about those governance systems and how they lock people in to these areas that just don't have the resources to actually meet all of the needs that we have, whether it's social, whether it's emotional, whether it's health, whether it's hunger. Those things are unfortunately, they leave communities in a very difficult situation to be able to manage it.
Thank you so much. You know, when you think about the mythology of scarcity, and how it is that we wrap our brains around the fact that there is no limit to human ingenuity, there is no limit to human productivity, and there shouldn't be a limit to the urgency that you're describing, the sense of urgency, because if we did this right, and if we concentrated around opportunity that our communities offer, we could end intergenerational cycles of poverty within one generation. And that would take the type of concerted effort that you're describing. So thank you for that, Majority Leader. Representative McGee, I'm going to come back to you in just a second, because this notion that keeps sticking in my ear about literacy and bondage and some of the work that you've done in reentry. But first, Representative Miller, you know, I think we would be remiss to identify a couple of important facts. Before the pandemic, the dual pandemics of social justice and, of course, COVID over the last few months, we had a literacy problem. We had an access to opportunity problem in literacy. So many of our children, as Representative McGee said, almost 70% in some of our cities weren't reading to proficiency. That's a missed opportunity in so many different ways. The pandemic has only exacerbated those problems. And not only that, to your point, Majority Leader, those issues of lack of access to reading have poured outside of the traditional places where we see them. So now it's truly a statewide issue. Tell us a little bit about why this is important to you, Representative Miller, not only as a targeted way of addressing what has worsened in the last few months, but also as a way of bringing opportunity to so many of our children that really deserve it.
So, as Representative Jason Rojas and Senator Gary, because he was represented, but Gary Winfield, we started this, what was it, Jason, 2011, 12, that we started this work. And what we wanted to do, Steve, is that we wanted to not promote students if they were not able to read after third grade. And there was so much pushback on that. And so we were told that it was going to cost the state about $50 million to ensure that every child could read by the end of third grade, because that's what we wanted to do. And so this work, we've been pushing it, and I've been pushing. I put a bill out last year, a couple of years ago, in that we have to be intentional about making sure these children can read, because what we're doing is we're not giving them the opportunity to succeed. For me, it's personal. Yes, the state, the economy, all of that is good, but this work is very, very important. And I'll tell you, Steve, with this pandemic, I'm afraid of what it's going to look like, what our education system is going to look like, the education of these children is going to look like after the pandemic, after COVID, post-COVID. That we had a concern and there was an alarm before COVID. Imagine what that alarm is going to be after COVID. And so when you look at the title of this bill that I introduced, Right to read. Our students, we have to understand that they have the right to know how to read. They have a right. And so this is a social justice issue as far as I'm concerned. It's a civil rights issue going back to Shavar. This is a civil rights issue. It's about equity and making sure that they have access to succeed. Because I've seen individuals who can't read and what happens to them. They end up on the street. And so we have to, this work is more important now than it was before. Because you use the word exacerbate, yeah, it has been. That's what COVID has done. And I feared, what would post-COVID look like had we implemented the initiatives that the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus put forth in 2011, 2012, up to this point? What would it look like instead of piecemealing and giving them 5 pilot schools here and then 10 and saying, okay, if you're part of this, then you can get extra money if you're in an alliance district. But what would it have looked like, excuse me. I get excited because I'm so passionate about this, and I'm just afraid of what's going to happen to our students after COVID. Because I was concerned before, but I'm even more concerned. And so what this bill does is this bill goes outside of the LOB, where it's just Jason and Gary and Brandon and the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus, where we've brought in partners to help us with this. That's showing us how important it is. Where we have individuals like Shavar helping us. We have Amy Dowell helping us, and different agencies helping us, organizations helping us to make sure that every student in this state knows how to read. Every student has the opportunity to learn, to graduate, and to succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Miller. The notion of every student, you remind me how this initiative really does touch every corner of the state. And whether you're talking about children in high-performing districts who may need that extra help, who may need that targeted intervention, children on the spectrum of dyslexia, wherever they may be across the state, and how it is that we comply with ADA requirements to provide literacy interventions for them. Children who live in the quiet corners of the state, as we mentioned earlier, who because of poverty or circumstance can't access early literacy. What's interesting to us is that the foundation of learning to read, so that you can read to learn and to contextualize your world in a way that you can continue to absorb information, is so critically important and powerful. And you really do, I think you really do make the case powerfully. Brandon, this notion of literacy and bondage, that really does stick out to me, especially some of the work we've done together over the years through the leadership of many of you, several of you here, on reentry. Attorney Jeffries, you noted how for so long the right to read was withheld from people. And what we also know is that post the end of slavery, the institutionalization of the prison industrial complex really solidified. So it should be no mystery why it is that so many people who are incarcerated, by the way, also cannot read. So Brandon, I'd love to hear more about your vision for literacy as a life cycle benefit for so many people who are now suffering.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think it's always hard to follow up after Representative Miller and all of the other great panelists dropping the mic. But I think the question is poignant. It is one that we should probably spend more time beyond just a Facebook Live on this particular subject matter. I read an article just recently. It was the Black Star Project. They published some findings that just 10%, and this is Reading Crisis in America. They published a few findings that said just 10% of 8th grade Black boys in the U.S. are considered, in quotation marks, proficient in reading. And I quickly thought about areas like Hartford, Chicago, Detroit, and many other places. That number was even lower. Let that resonate. And so by contrast, I took a look at the National Assessment of Education Progress, and they found that 46% of white students are adequate readers by, let's say, 8th grade. And 17% of Black students as a whole are too. As a whole are too. So the achievement or the opportunity gap, which we used to call this thing, between the two races is startling. But the difference between the report that the National Assessment of Education Progress shared with us on Black students as a whole and the Black Star findings of just Black boys is also troubling to me. So it's not simply Black children in this case, and I'm speaking specifically about Black children, but Black and brown children in general who appear to be failing in the basics like literacy. It's all of our boys. And the reason I wanted to emphasize on that is because I could remember my mentor honing in on the importance of reading, the importance of going to school. So while we know reading is only one piece of the school puzzle, we also know that it's a foundational one. And when you talk about generational poverty, when you talk about generations of young people who unfortunately are unable to graduate, and I put it that way because sure, there's a responsibility on the family, there's a responsibility on that young person, but when you're not giving the tools or the resources to even compete with your counterparts, then what happens is we are basically, it's a life cycle of poverty and illiterate children that we're growing. And so when you begin thinking about policy and practice implications, you know, our thing here is we simply want to mitigate the desperate effects of COVID and pre-COVID on children and families, especially young children, Black and brown children. And so which is why I'm so honored to be in the room with these folks who had been working on this prior to me even coming to the legislature. Policy efforts, I think, moving forward, and I believe this policy recommendation will address the systemic racism and support equitable access to quality education for all children, especially children of color. So I could probably go on and on and on, but it's just important that more than ever, we know that now is the time to address this literacy crisis we're faced with here in the state of Connecticut.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Miller, your reflections.
Yes, Representative McGee said something that was very interesting that I wanted to talk about. When we talk about parental engagement, okay, studies say that parental engagement is very important to a child's education. But what about that parent that's a product of our broken system? We haven't given them the tools they need to educate their child, to help their child through school. So my mother had a elementary education. That's all she had. But she made sure that I was educated, but the school system picked up the weight. It was the school system. And so I don't know, and I've been, even as a parent with my daughter being in school, I said, I need a college education to help her with her homework. Educators are the experts. Parents are not the experts. So we have a responsibility to get them to school, but sometimes parents don't have the resources or tools they need to help their students, their kids in school. And so I think that we need to revisit this parent engagement piece. So what do? How do we empower the parents to be better parents, to help their children through school? But I always, I shy away from parental engagement because we haven't done our part in making sure the parents have the tools and resources they need to help their children succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Miller. You remind us of some of the concurrent efforts that are happening in the state around parent leadership, whether it's the Parent Leadership Training Institute or Parent C, small but mighty shops that are helping parents not only understand that they have a voice, they're not just a parent, but they can be a leading advocate on behalf of their children and other children in the educational and civic spaces. So thank you for reminding us of the necessity to continue to invest in those programs. They're so small, but they make a big impact. So thank you for that. One of the things that's so remarkable about the literacy initiative in the state of Connecticut is that it truly is a bipartisan effort, a nonpartisan effort, I should say. But not only that, there are a couple of, we're not going to really dive too deeply during this conversation about the actual bill that you have proposed, but a couple of things that come to mind are how the bill is poised to really bring in resources from not only federal resources, but also resources from philanthropy and other areas to really support the resources that we invest here in the state. Another remarkable thing about the literacy bill is how it really proposes to have a comprehensive system, systems talking to each other, agencies talking to each other in buttressing literacy so that we understand that the impact is not just in the schoolhouse, but throughout the infrastructure of opportunity. Attorney Jeffries, one of the things that's remarkable about Connecticut is that many times we lead the country with some of our ideas and initiatives, but we also listen. And in literacy, we paid very close attention at the time to what was happening in Florida and Colorado. But there are other states, I think of Tennessee, that have really led the way in nonpartisan efforts to improve literacy attainment. Can you share with us some more about what you know is happening in other states that we might learn from in Connecticut?
Sure. Yeah, I would say a few things. Full day kindergarten, we know matters a lot. We've seen, Colorado just passed an initiative there. We've seen that in New York City. Fully funded preschool matters a lot. New Jersey, through our Abbott remedies, provides free preschool for 3 and 4 year olds in our urban communities where the local community doesn't have the tax base to fund preschool. Because we know that in order for kids to read, generally we will need our kids proficient by 4th grade. We have kids starting kindergarten already behind. So the more we can have our kids at the starting line with everyone else at kindergarten is very important. And then a few other pieces we see in many states throughout the country also include standards and accountability. So we have to have the resource conversation. That's a very important conversation. And the parent engagement piece is important as well. But parents also deserve the right that when you drop your baby off, that school should be buttoned up and be able to deliver for that student. And that parent should be able to go to work and do the things they got to do to put food on the table, trusting that the system will deliver what it's supposed to deliver. And so that's where the standards and accountability conversation has to be had. We have to have high standards for what we expect from our educators each and every day to deliver quality literacy instruction each and every year. And then we have to have some assessments. In that, we don't obviously want to have over testing. That's very problematic. But at the same time, you got to have quality data so we can know how our students are doing, primarily from a formative assessment standpoint, so you can fill gaps in real time. This isn't about gotcha after the fact. It's primarily about let's get that data in real time so that we can fill any gaps that any particular student might have. And then the third piece I would say, so you have resources, standards and accountability second. Then the third piece, which is also very important, is reimagining teacher prep, diversifying our teacher force. So teachers report, over 2/3 of teachers report that what they learn in graduate schools of education didn't prepare them to deliver quality instruction in the classroom. And so we have to reimagine our graduate schools of ed so that they're less abstract, less theoretical, frankly, more clinical, which is what the teacher's saying they need, so that they can get those real skills from pedagogy, classroom management, how to deliver instruction, so they can provide what our students need from the door. And then finally, the data is quite clear that the more we get Black and brown teachers in front of our babies, the better our students do. There's not only the role modeling effect, but there's also the extent to which, frankly, sometimes, we see, according to the research, oftentimes Black and brown teachers believe more in our children, believe more in their capacities to excel. And so if we can do those three things, make sure the resources are there, but then have the standards and accountability to make sure the system is working, and then begin to reimagine teacher prep, diversify our teaching force. We've seen in communities throughout the country, when those pieces are in place, our kids can really get to the next level.
Thank you, Attorney Jeffries. I know that we might be interrupted by Representative Miller coming back on shortly. She is going to have to leave us early. But in the interim, Majority Leader Rojas, you are a parent of children that live in a district that was an early adopter of what we used to call the CK3LI initiative, which has become so much more for the state of Connecticut. As a parent and a leader, tell us why it's important for you that your district was an adopter and what that meant for you and your kids and your community.
Yeah, no, sure. Listen, over the past several years, we've seen the district really improve in terms of performance of our students. Your reading scores among East Hartford students have increased by approximately 50%. We're seeing gains across grades. Data shows that in East Hartford Public Schools, they've actually performed better to some of the other opportunity districts that we're aware of. East Hartford Public Schools outpaced state growth trends, improving over 3% in English language arts for all students. And they saw a 26% increase in Smarter Balance ELA performance too over the last 5 years. And a lot of that comes down to leadership, right? We have a superintendent who believed in this program and a superintendent who wanted to empower building principals to also adopt a commitment to reading and a focus on reading. And also it was important that CK3LI also helped us build capacity within the school building. We all know that when you get grant funds for something, or you do something on a pilot basis, the resources eventually go away. And that was the beauty of CK3LI. It was about building a culture and a leadership and a culture of reading, and empowering our teachers and training our teachers and cross-training teachers so that we could build capacity within the district, so that knowledge that was being acquired by teachers in the classroom could be passed on to their colleagues, so that they could work with each other on best practices, so they could share data with each other about the children that they often share within a school building, so that you could really build that culture of reading that is so necessary to empower children to be able to develop the literacy skills that we need them to do. And that's why it's so important that we're continuing that work. And we also know that this was research-based, and it was scientific-based, and it was also evaluated by the NEAC school. So we know that that works. And that's important, right? Because for a period of time, and going back to 2012, there was a whole lot of reform going on. And it really vilified teachers in a lot of ways. It created a wall between policymakers and our teachers at the time, which obviously left a lot of bad blood out there, which is to the detriment of our kids. So our teachers, who are educators, right, they know that they are always looking to grow. Just as they expect their children to go in their classroom, they also expect to grow themselves professionally, and they want to learn more. They want to be better teachers. But what we need to do is ensure that what we're providing them is research-based, right? They don't want the latest fad that comes from time to time around education. When we talk about education reform, it's always just kind of pulling whatever might be the hottest topic at the time. In 2012, I think all of the energy went into talking about teacher evaluation, which is always so important, right? But it was to the detriment of almost everything else within the education reform bill. And one of the components, in my opinion, the most successful piece that came out of the 2012 education reform efforts here in Connecticut was the reading piece, right? And it's probably gotten the least attention because so much of it got caught up in the politics of vilifying teachers, and that was really to the detriment of our kids. And we now have an opportunity to go back to them with something that's been evaluated and shown to work, and we can empower them to be the best teachers that I believe they really want to be.
Thank you, Majority Leader. For the benefit of our panelists and also for our Facebook Live viewing public, just want to note that Representative Miller is tending to a family emergency. So please join us in our prayers for her and her family as she does that. Representative McGee, I wanted to ask you a similar question. The research is sound and the science is clear that literacy interventions, when targetedly addressed for the needs of the child, really do work. So what would that mean, and what does that mean for the community that you represent and as a parent?
It would help if I unmute, right? I mean, Jason has already said it. Shavar has said it. I mean, when you invest into our education system, specifically literacy, we're talking less children going into the judicial system, more children going to college, more children working in jobs where they're making money to take care of their families. So it's not rocket science in all of this, but it is a puzzle that we have to strategically kind of put together to ensure that our children are on the winning side of it and that we're supporting our teachers, as Jason said. I remember those conversations. And, you know, when we were in sort of physical space, thousands of teachers coming up to testify in opposition to the work that we were trying to put forth at the time. But I just believe if we, the legislature, and we, the human folks who have children and understand the importance of education, like would definitely support the movement of supporting policies like the one that we're talking about today. Aside from that, though, I just think it's important that we don't lose the pandemic. And what I mean by that is, while we're talking about the importance of literacy, this pandemic has hit our communities even harder. I mean, we often talk about there was a pandemic before the pandemic in the healthcare system, in the housing, area, job market, et cetera. This literacy piece is even more important. Our kids have lost literally a year and a half. And I'm not pointing fingers. Our teachers, our educators are doing the best that they can with what they have available to them. But I got to tell you, it's devastating to hear some of the numbers, to hear directly from constituents whose children are just at a loss. And hopefully, Shavar, as you said, Stephen, we listen to a lot of folks outside of Connecticut to help inform strategies moving forward. Hopefully Shavar and other stakeholders and partners could work with us to ensure that we pass a piece of legislation with the majority leader on the call tonight as well. A legislation that's funded and we're able to support districts throughout the state.
Such an important point, Representative, and each of you really, in recalling that early struggle, that hearts and minds struggle with our teachers and our school leaders about the importance of literacy. Once we were able to decouple teacher evaluation, move aside from the notion that this was punitive, and really talk about this and resource this as a resource for the educator, so many teachers came to us and said, I wish I had known that this worked. I wish I had learned about this in my early training to become a teacher in pre-service. I wish I knew. And that is such a powerful statement from teachers who really do want to make a difference on behalf of their children. They just need the skills and they need the science and research-based practices to do so. Attorney Jeffries, one of the things that Representative McGee raises is the pandemic and so much of the lessons learned in the past few months. Can you tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, what some of those salient lessons are and how we can use those lessons to really move the needle in this particular initiative?
Yeah. I mean, I think one is we need to get to one-to-one student, one student for every student needs to have access to the internet and high-speed internet. And fortunately, with our new president, he's looking to make those investments. Some of those dollars were made available in the prior COVID bills. That's needed pre, during, and post-pandemic, because we know those students who have broadband access and high-speed internet access, they can engage in continuous learning. And too many of our low-income families simply don't have that access. Even now, in the middle of the pandemic, in too many communities, we still have students who don't have the broadband access. So that's a lesson I think we learned, that we really need to double up. I mean, the internet access right now is basically your new textbook. And so we got to make sure all of our students have that type of access. And frankly, I mean, what we've seen throughout the country in our work is low-income communities tend disproportionately to be the schools where kids still are not in school. We have many communities where we do work where we're going on now almost a year that students have been out of the school building. We've seen in upper income communities, we've seen those communities get their kids back into school faster. Private schools have done that. We know we have some different challenges. Oftentimes our low income communities are more dense, which lends itself to more prevalent COVID transmission. Oftentimes our low income communities have more people use public transportation. So that's an issue you got to be thoughtful about. And we know a lot of our communities, we have frontline workers who aren't in white collar jobs where they can work from home. They got to go out into the world to work. So those are all real risks. But at the same time, we also know there's a huge risk to continuing to have so many of our students at home, parents oftentimes out of the house in order to work, no childcare, no coverage, kids at home having to go on the internet and figure out a way to learn. Even some of our districts, we also learned that if you're going to have remote, you better have synchronous learning. We still have too many districts where they're asynchronous, which means the student or their parent has to go at some point during the day, find the lesson and receive a recorded lesson versus live instruction through a distance learning platform with the student in front of the teacher. So it really just highlighted many of the inequities we really know about, which is really why we got to get our kids back in school. The science is pretty clear that schools are generally low risk environments as long as you have the practicing of hand washing, the wearing of the mask, and the social distancing. I fear we're going to have generational harms that our kids are going to suffer. We've gotten some early data that's showing 50, 60, even 70% drops in both literacy as well as math proficiency. These numbers continue to accelerate each week that students are outside of the schools. And so this is something we're obviously thoughtfully in partnership with our teachers unions and our educators, but we got to get these babies back into school or too many of them may not be able to recover.
Attorney Jeffries, with the majority leader here and a member of the Appropriations Committee here, I think the question always rises to the top: where are we going to find these resources for this work? Understanding that the resources are so critically important. But, we have to get creative. One of the things that you've reminded me of is some of these federal resources for the COVID response can be targeted for literacy interventions. Some of the recovery resources can be targeted for this type of intervention that we know that works, especially because of the exacerbated gap. So thank you for that. As we are starting to draw to a close, Majority Leader, I just wanted to come back to you one more time. So much of your ambitious plan that you noted earlier in the conversation about understanding, connecting the dots, about how all these things are connected, but also a vision for breaking intergenerational cycles of poverty and expanding access to opportunity to so many of our children that have not had it before. Tell me a little bit about the style and the urgency of leadership which you will employ to promote not only the literacy work, but all of this interconnected work that flows along with it.
I was thinking about the comments Shavar made about resources, and one of the things I think we have to keep top of mind are what are the opportunity costs of doing nothing, right? We all know if we don't prepare children to read from kindergarten and first and second grade, we're going to start paying a price, right? How much extra money taxpayer money do we spend to address issues that otherwise could have been prevented, right? We know that it results in the over-identification of children of color for special education. We know that every community complains about special education costs and not having enough resources. If you assess children early enough, and if you involve the right interventions in kindergarten and first and second grade, you avoid that over-identification of primarily African-American boys in particular into special education. And then you think about the later years where they just continually fall behind, and then we begin to lose them to the streets. I've mentioned to you, I'm really interested. I'm trying to find really innovative literacy programs for our correction system, right? We all know 70% of our inmates here in Connecticut are functionally illiterate, right? We should be investing. After meeting with the Department of Corrections Commissioner, I didn't know that the state of Connecticut puts no money into Unified School District number 1. No state funds. It's all federally funded. We are not investing in it. So what are the opportunity costs there when we're spending $40,000 a year for an inmate, but we're struggling to get to $14,000 or $15,000 a year per student in most of our school districts? Knowing that a lot of our wealthy communities are spending $16,000, $17,000 and talking about how we waste money in our cities, in our lower income communities. So, I think we need to frame it in economic terms for a lot of people to actually care about the issue, because at the end of the day, pocketbook issues are really what drive people to want to find solutions or not. And I don't know that we've spent enough time really digging down to determining the opportunity cost of not addressing something as foundational, right? And sometimes as basic as literacy and reading. Quite frankly, I think it's something that's easily taken for granted. I think we take for granted that our teachers know how to teach reading. They're teachers, right? We assume they know how to teach reading, but if they're not actually taught the science of reading during their prep program, they're not going to be as best prepared, I think, as they can be. And I think they want to embrace that. But we're going to have a conversation with the higher education community too. I work in higher education outside of politics. Very smart people. Many times they believe they can't be told how to improve how they do their job, right? So we're going to have a real conversation with higher education too, in terms of how our teacher preparation programs are structured and ensuring that they're giving those future teachers the best resources, the best experience, and the best opportunity to come in and do what I think they want to do, which is ensure that children are learning.
You know, your point is well taken, Majority Leader. As our state is aging, so many might ask, what is in it for me? My children are grown, they've left the state, and it's not my priority anymore as much as it was. You know, we also concurrently have an aging in place strategy for the state of Connecticut. We want our aging population to live here, thrive here, post-retirement. It seems to me that, to your point, a robust workforce of young people that are entering these markets could really help support some of our strategies that impact the entire life cycle for the state of Connecticut. Thank you for that, Majority Leader. Representative McGee, it seems to me that our teachers are, in so many ways, our heroes. Our teachers are refining their skill set to match their energy to teach our young people. What do you think about paying them more?
Why not? I mean, we're talking about educating the most vulnerable population, if you would. And it is such an honorable profession to literally shape the minds of our young people, and yet they get paid the least. I'm all for it. However, there is a conversation we must have around accountability in some of these districts where our children aren't learning anything. And whose responsibility is that? It is our educators, it's our administrators, it's those folks who are getting paid an awful lot of money to manage districts, and yet our kids are still falling by the wayside. It's our responsibility, right? And so it's also the time for us to really talk about the funding of our education system. We call it ECS, education cost sharing. And I know at some point we'll have a conversation on the importance of student-centered funding, right? And what does that mean? So I don't want to get too far out there on my soapbox, but I do think that they deserve some more money, obviously with some accountability connected to it. There are educators in my family, I'm sure in Jason's family, Shavar, as well as you, Steve, and we understand the importance of taking care of our educators because, I mean, we're not naive, right? We know that there are some challenges that they're faced with, and we want to be of support to them as well.
Thank you for that, Representative. As we come upon the hour, I just want to note that this is the first of a series of conversations. I'm reminded for your call to dig a little deeper on some of these issues, and that's exactly what we intend to do. And we also intend to continue to think about literacy as a through thread of opportunity in so many of the issues that we think about, and how literacy attainment is truly a life cycle developmental benefit for the residents of the state. Attorney Jeffries, I really do want to give you the opportunity to give us some of your last thoughts and words. The state of Connecticut is in a moment, I think, of opportunity and a critical moment in the future of its residents. What is your advice as we move forward?
Well, first, again, thanks for having me. Amazing leaders that you have. The advice I have is, just always remember the babies are amazing. I mean, the babies are brilliant. They're amazing. They're created to fly. To me, they're like a seed. We know anything about a seed. We remember back in high school class, right? If you have oxygen, water, and sunlight, what's already inside of them automatically bursts. And what's, of course, inside of a seed is a tree that gives life to us all, right? None of us be here without trees. I just think about the babies like that. All you got to do is create the right environmental conditions, and the greatness that's already inside of them will automatically reveal itself. And that's our job as adults, as leaders, as policymakers. And so in this moment, my biggest advice is we got to get these babies back in school as soon as possible. Obviously, safely, that goes without saying. The CDC, Dr. Fauci, pretty clear that I've said repeatedly, schools are pretty low risk environments as long as we implement the protocols in terms of hand washing, social distancing. The feds have provided these resources. I believe more resources will be coming. I'm sure there's going to be all types of our communities where we'd like to have more. We never have all the resources we want, but we also know we have enough to begin to provide our kids the type of education that they deserve. And the data is crystal clear. Literally every day that they're at home, particularly our low-income students, we know how it is. A lot of single parents, they got to go out to work. They're hustling to make ends meet, doing the best they can to check homework and make sure the students are learning. That's just not sustainable. And so my biggest advice is these babies are amazing. They're brilliant. They're our future leaders. Let's get them back in school so we can make sure they're getting what it is that they deserve.
Thank you, Attorney Jeffries. Our babies are amazing. I love that framing. I love that you brought that to the table, created to fly. The right to read is really about human dignity. And each of you has helped frame that opportunity tonight. Again, I want to send on behalf of all of us and our public our prayers to Representative Miller and her family as they confront their familial issues tonight. And I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us tonight. Your leadership is exemplary, and it's a real promise for the state of Connecticut. And I thank you for partaking in this conversation tonight. Have a good evening.
Thank y'all. This has been great.
Yeah, this was
pleasure.
good. Thank you. And my kids just came in, so this is good timing.